very pleased to be with you tonight, even though electronically, the best we can do. And, soon we'll be out of it, but right now that's what it is. And I'll be happy to answer all kinds of questions. My topic tonight has to do with a cathedral ceiling that a friend of mine pointed out to me about 10, 12 years ago. And I immediately went over there and I was fascinated by it. And I've been working on it for a number of years because my degree is in literature. It's not in art history and I'm not a medievalist. So I had to school myself for a number of years. So this is the product. And so I have a PowerPoint for you. And so Brian, could we have next? Jim, yes. Okay, very good. So this is it, the Convivencia on Teruel's 13th century Romanesque-Gothic Boudeja Cathedral ceiling. In other words, it's a mixture of artistic idioms, and this is what is so unusual about it. Next. And this is the church, and this is the ensemble of churches. Now, if you might want to know where Teruel is, not too many people know it. We know when I mention it to people, they say, oh, there was a very bloody war in the Civil War, 1936. Indeed, there was. But other than that, not too many people know where Teruel is. As you can see, it's in the region of Aragon. It's in the southernmost corner of Aragon, right here. Next. And so the question is, what is convivencia? Convivencia is a term that means living together. It has come to mean the productive coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in medieval Iberia. It is a culture that distinguishes the Spanish Middle Ages from the rest of Europe. There was nothing like it anywhere else in Europe, certainly not for the length of time. But it was not something that was all over Iberia. It was moment specific and place specific. And it lasted for almost 8 centuries, believe it or not, until 1492, when the Spanish Jews were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. Now, I want to highlight the concept of convivencia in this presentation against the backdrop of the book that I'm reading now, which is Isabel Wickerson's best-selling book called Caste, and its implications for our democracy. As we well know, our democracy is being threatened, has been threatened for several years now, but not only here in America, but also elsewhere. So this is very, very important. It's a real beacon. Next. So Teruel's 13th century convivencia appears stunningly represented on the ceiling of the Cathedral of Santa Maria de Mediavilla. Its colorful and profusely painted images spanning the entire central nave of this cathedral. This is a profusely painted work, very large, very extensive. Next. Now, it appears in an interesting idiom, the so-called language of tolerance, known as the mudejar aesthetic. This is an aesthetic that is absolutely indigenous to Iberia, indigenous to Spain. It took hold in the wake of the Christian conquest of Moorish-controlled lands starting in the 12th century. Now, Boudeja architecture is seen in massive Romanesque-Gothic structures decorated with arabesques, geometric shapes, glaze of light and dark, usually in brick, and the use of ceramics, as we will see here on Teruel's cathedral facade. Boudeja art, however, entails the combination of Christian figural images with Islamic abstract patterns and designs. Next. Now you see here the cathedral, the facade of the cathedral. It's got the usual massive doorways, the massive structures, but then it has all of these very strange, certainly strange for the rest of Europe, decorations in all kinds of different geometric shapes, and particularly here in Teruel, there are ceramic plates, ceramic colors and designs. Next. Now, Boudeja art, however, is, as I said, a combination of figural images. And what we see here is a stunning number of diverse medieval figures. In effect, this has been often remarked as being a combination of a Gothic tapestry with an Oriental rug. We see a very interesting combination. And as far as going to look at the people, you will see here, right here, you will see a Jewish man in a dark cowl. Right next to him is a Christian saint with a halo. Right next to is a lady, charming looking blue-clad lady. Next to her is a woman holding up an apple, and we consider this to be some kind of a virtuous lady, but also the apple is often considered has all kinds of connotations. Going down here, we see again another saint, and we see a merchant. I think he's a merchant. We're not quite sure, but he has a gold background, and he's holding a parchment document. If we skip over here, we see a woman who looks like a scold. Her arms are akimbo. You know, she's has something to tell us. And the funny thing about this work of art, it has been restored a couple of times, and sometimes not so fortuitously. Right here, we see a woman in 20th century dress, as you can see, not a medieval figure. I guess these people did not know what they were doing when they restored it, but that happens. We see it in the newspaper all the time. Restorations are not always very, very successful. Could we go next, please? Now we have here another slide. Again, this is all the same beautiful ceiling. We have here a woman with a veil over her face. Here we have a peasant woman. Here we have a woman with a fleur de lis baton. Here we have another peasant woman, and she's pointing to her eyes. This was a very, very visual culture. We don't know exactly what these figures mean. We have to interpret. One of the reasons that this work of art has not been very well known in the Anglo-Saxon world is that there are no records. We'll tell you a little bit later why there are no records. And Spanish art historians have a tendency to describe and not interpret. Most of what you're going to hear tonight is my interpretation. Here again, you have this two laborers with veils over their faces, and here you have an elegant lady again who's holding a fleur de lis. And anyway, you see all of these beautiful abstract images, which are Islamic for the most part. Not always, but for the most part. Next. Now, a little bit of history. Now, medieval Iberia was divided into two parts. Moorish Iberia, roughly from 711 to 1085, and Christian Spain from 1085 to 1492. In 711, the Visigothic Spain was overrun by a small band of North African Muslims who crossed Gibraltar and in short order managed to overrun the country and create an absolutely brilliant civilization, mostly in Andalusia. Known as Al-Andalus, this culture is known for the storied convivencia in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews contributed notable achievements pretty much in all endeavors in science, medicine, agriculture, philosophy, literature, art, and architecture. In 10th century Cordoba was the most advanced city of its time with paved streets, bathhouses, hospitals, libraries, schools. In Toledo's famed school of translators, Jewish and Muslim scholars made the Greek classics available in Latin for European consumption. They translated them from Greek into Arabic, and then into Latin, and then into Castilian. Next, please. Now, the story of Moorish Spain is a sad one. It didn't last that long. By the 12th century, the Caliphate of Cordoba had collapsed, replaced by a handful of taifas, weak little kingdoms warring with each other. Meanwhile, there was a Christian Reconquista. There was a long drawn movement to recapture and reconquer one by one the lands occupied by the Moors. This Reconquista was gaining ground. The threatened Taifa leaders called for help to their North African co-religionists and saw the arrival of two quite fundamentalist and not very cultured groups, the bellicose Almoravide tribe, followed by the more fundamentalist Almohades. Now, the Moorish Spain, Moorish Iberia was used to a certain degree of culture, which these tribes did not have. They made the conditions, living conditions, very difficult. And so the result of this, plus the fact that the Christian Reconquista won a very notable victory in 1212, resulted in a mass migration of Andalusians to the newly conquered territories in the Christian north, one of them being Teruel. Please, next. Now, founded in 1176, the frontier territory of Teruel became a stepping stone towards the conquest of Valencia as well as a hybrid political experiment. The town of Teruel was put under the jurisdiction of the King of Aragon, and in stark contrast stood the province of Teruel, which was subject to feudal vassals, military orders, and the church. In other words, this was a really interesting hybrid experiment. One part was still feudal, and the other part was much more progressive. Now, to fortify and populate the town of Teruel, the pragmatic colonists offered incentives to settlers regardless of origin or cultural tradition. These settlers that came from all parts of France, as well as all parts of Iberia, they came very enthusiastically because they were promised written laws and equal protection, tax abatements for married couples, property rights to men and women, and the right to repudiate one's partner and remarry. Of course, the word divorce did not exist, so repudiation was the word. Now, these attractive incentives resulted in a flood of immigrants from France and different parts of Iberia, mostly Andalusian Christians, Jews, conversos, and Muslims eager to make a home and build community. Next, please. Now, these people were joined by mudejares, hence the name Boudeja art. These are Muslims who stayed in their land because they were economically useful to the colonies. Together with the mixed people who had come, the mixed settlers, they created an unprecedented community, one that recalled Al-Andalus. Most of these people from Andalusia brought their culture, brought their legacy. Now, we do not know what Al-Andalus looked like as the aniconic meaning no imagery, no icons. Aniconic art of Moorish Iberia excluded human and animal imagery. So we don't know what people of Cordoba, 10th century Cordoba, looked like. But we do have a vivid image of life in medieval Teruel precisely because of the groundbreaking visuality of the mudejar aesthetic. It is this vivid and colorful hybrid art that enabled 13th century Iberians living in a Christian enclave to actually see themselves in line and color, probably for the first time, and thus take cognizance of their quotidian reality and reinforce their pluralistic identity. Next, please. Now, Teruel's artists could now distinguish a Jew wrapped in a dark cowl from a Christian knight, or mudejar artisans in colorfully striped tunics building the very ceiling on which they are featured, as I will show you. Similarly, they could depict a woman laborer wearing the Islamic veil next to an elegant noble lady. Amazingly, within this Catholic sanctuary, they could even represent their contrasting faiths by means of religious epigrams written in Latin and Gothic. It was a new way of seeing, a new way of feeling and experiencing life. Next. Now here we have these, we've already seen the guy with the cowl, we've already seen the noble, the elegant lady, but here we have these these artisans who are building the very ceiling on which they're being featured. In other words, there was a very self-conscious, this was a very self-conscious kind of art. Next. And here, of course, we have the laborer, the mudejar laborer. She's pulling on a pulley, and the elegant lady, the elegant Christian lady. So we have these incredible comparisons to be made. These are all people right next to each other, rubbing shoulders on this ceiling. Next, please. And surprise, surprise, we have the Latin Cum Benedicto from the Ave Maria prayer, and the Quranic Malk blessing in Gothic letters in reverse. This is really quite amazing. We're talking about a Catholic sanctuary in medieval Spain. Next, please. Now, in this rich visual narrative, with this extraordinary variety of individuals from all walks of life, they could see, these people who were looking at it could see societal change from feudalism to urban growth and capitalism. Now, you're seeing different occupations, social classes, and cultural traditions rubbing elbows. Knights, merchants, tradesmen, musicians, serfs, kings, saints, dancing women, acrobats, soldiers, lawyers, gymnasts, potters, spinners, peasants, ecclesiastics, artisans. Also, you see different clerics ministering to different needs, which you'll see in a moment. We're going to see different types of love. As a challenge to medieval misogyny, you're going to feast. They feasted their eyes on an unusual abundance of women in different roles. This is something that you do not see in any Catholic church or cathedral or sanctuary. Rich ladies, wage-earning women, and sexually provocative dancers. Next, please. Now. Okay, we'll see in a moment. I also want to point out to you, this woman is a poetess, and she's, we don't see it too well, but because it's small, but she is declaiming. We'll talk about this guy later. We see here something very, very interesting. We see here a licenciado who is a lawyer, and he is in charge of orthodoxy. He is in charge of seeing that the laws are obeyed. Next to him, we see in profile, which is significant because whenever you have somebody in profile, that means they're a little bit wayward. This is a bishop. He has a bishop's hat on, and he is playing an Arabic instrument. There are a number of ways of interpreting this, but the interesting thing is that they're juxtaposed. And here we see next, please. Next. We'll see the other guys later. We see here a feudal knight, a wealthy burgher, and a nervous tradesman. I find this very interesting because, his background is red, and he has his hand on his forehead, and he's clutching at his robe. He really seems like, one of the nervous people at the stock exchange. This guy, is his background is gold, so he's also dressed from head to foot in red. He seems to be a successful, rich guy. Whether he's a government official or a rich merchant, we really do not know. And this young man is, in a sense, passé because the feudal society is waning. Next, please. Okay, here we see also something very interesting. We see a very elegantly clad priest. Here we see a priest who's barefooted. Here's another one who's barefooted with a sack on his shoulder. We're talking about the new orders that are coming into being, the feudal and Dominican, the Dominican and feudal mendicants. Who believe in poverty. This guy is very richly clad, very different kind of ecclesiastic. Next, please. Okay, here we see something that is also quite mind-blowing. These two maybe adulterous lovers, we don't really know. We see some, two lightly clad men in what seems to be a mano battle. And here we see a very orthodox couple, a probably married couple, but this is something quite unusual. I will tell you that in the 1950s, you did not see people sleeping in the same bed in American movies. However, in the Middle Ages, you seem to see it in Teruel. So much to say that Teruel was very obviously very progressive for its time. Next, please. We see an amazing number of women. About 50% of the images are women. This is quite mind-blowing. There are, again, many interpretations one can give, which is that the women who came, these settlers, were women who, had to build a home and community. They had to work. And many of the men went off to war in Valencia, so they were in charge. They controlled the purse strings. So we have here, we already saw this woman who's like a scold. This is a spinner, a very traditional woman. Woman. This one is somebody who's telling us, look carefully. There's something to be seen here, and she seems to be a peasant and barefooted. Next, please. And here we have a musician. There's a lot of music. A lot of music to be had. Most of the entertainers were Muslims, were mudejares. Here we have a woman poetess and declaiming, an actress. And here we have a gymnast. And she is holding two swords in her hand. Quite an interesting, these are very performative women. Next, please. And here we have sexy dancers. I don't know that there's any getting away from it. This woman is much too sexy for a Christian a sanctuary, and she certainly, she tells us that these people actually existed. She could be a prostitute. This one looks kind of like a transgender, given her muscular build. Again, we don't know, but in other words, this is quite unusual. Next, please. All right, so these Iberians, these Teruelenses, were looking at the ceiling, and they could see the military features of the society, but they could also see lay artists and artisans at work. Significantly, they could appreciate their own spiritual development and the consciousness of their common humanity, illustrated by individuals on opposite sides of the social spectrum, which we will see in a moment. A knight and a beggar are served, both ensnared by that all-purpose symbol of evil, the dragon snake. Please, next. So here we have the Reconquista Knights, and the next image is, next, please. And here we have a beautiful frieze of these workers, these artisans who are building, and you've already seen the building of the roof. In the middle is a sort of an orderly who is giving. He's got his arms crossed, and he's giving drink and wine and water to these workers. And this is a very, very beautiful frieze. And as you can see, there is an almost infinite variety of abstract images. Some of them are Christian, they're heraldic. Here is another heraldic one, but most of them are Muslim. Next, please. Now here I found this to be quite interesting. We have a society where poor people are stigmatized, as they in a sense are in every society. But here there is something very unusual. We see a knight, one of the privileged classes, ensnared by a serpent. And we also see a serf or a beggar also ensnared. His teeth gridded. In other words, we see the concept of the common humanity in the face of evil. Next, please. Another thing that you see here, very interestingly, is their appreciation of literature. This is the roman de renard. This is a tricky fox, and he comes from the literature called the fabliaux, which comes from the Arab world, and it was brought to Iberia by the returning Crusades. And here we see an interesting thing here, two young people climbing an apple tree, and one can read the Adam and Eve story here, not sure, but the fact is that it's the woman who seems to be on top. Not the male. She's the one who is the initiator. This seems to be a very matriarchal society, even if it was militaristic, even if it was a misogynist society. So there are a lot of contradictions, a lot of ideas that are clashing here. Excuse me, I am very sorry for my cough. Please, next. Now, interesting are the borrowings, exchanges, and collaborations in this society that manifest hybridity across the board. In a workshop, mudejar women illustrators are seen painting panels with heraldic images. Curiously, around the time Teruel's ceiling was being painted, figural images began to appear for the first time on the white and green ceramics of mudejar potters. These potters may have also illustrated women potters actually may have also illustrated some of the ceiling's panels. Very significantly, they were willing to sidestep their Islamic prohibition against the making of figural images in order to boost their ceramic production. Please, next. You see them here, these female artisans, female illustrators are painting heraldic images. These particular images, these particular shields are the shields of the crown of Aragon with its parallel lines. Next, please. And here we have these curious 13th century ceramics. But for the very first time, we see the appearance of animal images and female images or human images. This is quite unusual. In other words, there was a lot of cross collaboration, borrowing, exchanges of all kinds. Next, please. I introduced this slide here just to show you how many beautiful and varied abstract images these people put together on the ceiling. Next. Okay. Now, what is interesting is that Teruel's ceiling brims with new ideas, with opulence, and with optimism. There is very little in the way of conflict here. It's downplayed. What we see is a mixture of tradition and innovation. We see an infinite variety of lavish Islamic designs, suggesting that some of the artists were mudejar, perhaps even women. We see a profuseness and crowdedness reflective of 13th century Aragon's high population growth. It had its highest population growth ever. We see the development of a startup society into a flourishing multi-faith culture. We see a well-integrated, vibrantly secular community. The Christian aspect, the religious aspect is downplayed. It is mostly secular. We see a community that's very progressive for its time, a community that was rising on a crest, on a political and social crest. It is probably a coming-of-age story for the new millennium, and it very probably has a political agenda. I could accept all this. What I could not accept, what strained my credulity, however, was the extended image of a classless society viewed from below, from a populist perspective. Next. Now, like all medieval societies, Teruel was highly stratified with power lodged in the king, nobles, and ecclesiastics. That is a given. So how to explain the vision of figures of authority appearing next to farmers, common soldiers, laborers, prostitutes, and beggars? Now we know that the Fuero de Teruel, the body of written laws, provided egalitarian status, at least in principle. The reality being that this was a highly hierarchical social structure, but it did allow for upward mobility. In this thriving immigrant society, wealthy merchants, farmers, artisans could buy their way to status and power. Next. Now, a better explanation of why this has so is that this image of this Teruelense community, 13th century community, is quite aspirational. It's also an effective vision. Art is not reality. It's the communication of feeling. And these images are expressive of a close-knit community, of a sense of solidarity, of an intimacy bordering on religion. This is a well-functioning, humanistic, self-satisfied society that speaks to an idealist vision of individuals standing shoulder to shoulder. A concept quite revolutionary, almost amazing. We have trouble coming up with this. It seems to be a fusion of personal feeling, it seems to have a political agenda, hence a convivencia. Next, please. Now, this was a very short-lived culture. It's a kind of a hinge of history, no more than 100 years. King James I's death in 1276 was replaced. The general well-being was replaced. The general well-being that characterized his reign was replaced with political maelstrom and open warfare among his heirs. By the end of the 13th century, Aragon was experiencing a series of downturns. The end of the medieval Mediterranean expansion, a leveling off in the economy, a fall in population growth, the nobility imposing its interests over the crown, a war between Castile and Aragon fought on Teruelense soil, the 1348 plague that devastated Europe, it decimated like 1/3 of the population, and the pogroms that by 1391 had decimated Barcelona's Jews. Next, please. Now, starting in the 14th and 15th century, all documents surrounding the construction and painting of Teruel ceiling disappeared, no doubt to erase any semblance of Muslim participation and authorship. Consequently, we do not know the names of the artists and artisans responsible, nor the mandate they were given, or the meaning and message of their illustrations that their illustrations were meant to convey. We don't even know exactly when this work was started, whether it was at the end of the 13th or the beginning of the 14th century. So Teruel's iconic ceiling remains an art historical mystery. But we do know that there was a historical event that confirmed the pluralist spirit and legacy so richly displayed on Teruel's iconic ceiling. Next. It was an event unique in the history of the Spanish Inquisition. By the way, one of the big experts on the Spanish Inquisition is the father of Bibi Netanyahu. In 1584, 7 years before the edict expelling the Jews from Spain, 2 inquisitors arrived in Teruel to set up a tribunal. Now, one of the reasons that they arrived is that Teruel had been earmarked as a place where a lot of the people in government at the highest echelons of society were married to conversos, to Jewish conversos. So since their big focus of interest was to eradicate any kind of impurity, Teruel was one of the targeted places. When these inquisitors arrived, they found themselves barred by the city's civil and ecclesiastical authorities. The inquisitors immediately issued an excommunication of the city and an interdiction of its magistrates, for which Teruel's churchmen obtained papal letters releasing the city, an action the Inquisition countered with a decree confiscating all of Teruel's public offices. Now, negotiations went back and forth over almost a year, and yet the community of Teruel continued to resist. It was only when King Ferdinand II intervened personally that the city was forced to submit.